Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 2 of my newest series, Dissecting the Divine, in which we look at God, an Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou. I love this book so very much. Chapter 2 is called Grounded. It is specifically about the feet of Yahweh. If you missed what this series is and you're feeling a bit lost, go and watch episode 1 here, where I explain what this book is, why I want to cover it with you guys, and why I think it's absolutely fantastic. P.S. I'm hoping that if I compliment Francesca enough here about this book, she will come on for at least one of these episodes. Maybe she can do chapter 21 with us, the autopsy, where we really dig into Yahweh. But I'm very, very excited to go through this with you. If you think that a certain body part sounds boring, oh, you know what, I don't want to watch the feet episodes, let's just wait till hands or torso or head. Trust me, they are all jam-packed full of history, archaeology, comparative religion, biblical scholarship, and on and on and on. Seriously, it's fantastic. And what I do here in each individual episode still will pale in comparison to the beauty, the intrigue, and the scholarship that Francesca shows us through each of these chapters. So I hope that you will join me on this new series. I'm so excited about it. Without further ado, let's dive into today's topic, which is one of 3 chapters that has to do with the feet and legs of Yahweh. This first chapter, which is chapter 2 of the book, is called Grounded, and we're going to be looking at mainly Yahweh's feet for this. So it starts off with Francesca recounting a trip that she did in Syria, where she visited a temple at Ain Dara, which isn't a Yahweh worship temple, but it had all of the exact same attributes as the temple described by Solomon. And so it allowed her to really envision what this would have been like. And sure enough, at the base of the temple are these 2 huge meter-long footprints of this God. And she steps her smaller feet into these larger imprints, and she understands there's no footprints coming out, it's only going in. The footprints show the presence of the God. And that's going to be a major theme as we look at everything that's to come in this chapter. The footprints are this very unique way to tie what is not quite tangible and make it more so. Footprints represent both that something physical was indeed here and does indeed exist, but is still part of some other realm, perhaps like a heavenly realm. And so she uses this temple at Ain Dara as a wonderful example of understanding what was going on at this time and place in history, the southern Levant, the ancient Near East, with the worship and belief in this whole litany of gods. And 2 of these worshipers at this time really existed, again, in a very physical and tangible way. And Yahweh is no exception, and you'll see that as we get into it. So these footprints represent so much, and she gives us a lot of examples of this, and some are really fun. We talk about, from an evolutionary perspective, Australopithecus afarensis, I'm sure I said that completely wrong, where we have the first footprints of bipedalism, and this is 3.5 million years ago. We have the footprints on the moon from Buzz Aldrin and what that signifies, which I think is a more apt and really good comparison. We have footprints of stars on the Hollywood squares, people we look up to or idolize. We want to know they were here. That's what footprints do. They connect us to the past and even to the present. They are a material memory conjuring up the whole figure. And it's not just Yahweh worshipers that really appreciated his feet. This is a tradition everywhere. She gives examples from Scandinavia. She gives examples of the Incan god, the sun god Inti, and the footsteps that supposedly are his in a certain part of Lake Titicaca. Much of this, though, seems to have its earliest roots around the Mediterranean area, where we see footprints left in stone, giant footprints of Heracles, or right next to it is Dionysus, and the comparison of whose footprints were bigger, meaning which god is more powerful. Size matters. It mattered to the people who worship these gods. You have to remember, many of them were worshiping these gods because of what the gods could do for them, because of how powerful they were. And no one believed at this time in a singular god. So within the pantheon, or within the competing gods, which one were you going to worship had to do with which one you thought was honestly the strongest. And the size of one's feet displayed that dominance and that power. And she gives a really beautiful example of Isis and the footprints that have been left behind for her, showing where she tread and the places that she would go and how worshipers followed those footprints around. Now, like anything, competition brings in a huge part of this. And so we see these competing footprints for, no, I'm going to claim that for my God. An example is in Sri Lanka, actually. There's a large depression in a rock that looks an awful lot like a large footprint in Sripada that many different people have tried to claim. We have the Hindus saying that this is the footprints of Shiva. The Buddhists say this is where Buddha actually placed his feet. Muslims will talk about how Adam marched there after he was banned from Eden. And the Christians have even gone as far as to say, no, these are the footprints of St. Thomas, as he was the one who was associated with bringing Christianity to this region. Even today, these kinds of things matter to us. Jerusalem is a hotbed of competing footprints. Whether it's the Mount of Olives, the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, etc., there are footprints, or what we consider to be footprints or impressions everywhere that different groups try to take different credit for. Is this Muhammad's footprint near the Dome of the Rock before he ascended? Well, the Crusaders would tell you that that is actually Jesus's very footprint, not Muhammad. We also have another claim of Jesus again on the Mount of Olives. And so it's not even just Old Testament with Yahweh, it's New Testament, this obsession with where the foot goes, showing the presence of this particular deity, a blessing almost by being in this particular area. But let's get more biblical about this. Let's really dive into different examples that we have, and they're so plentiful. If you just keep your eyes out for the word foot or tread or sandal, I mean, it is numerous. In Genesis, we hear about Yahweh's footsteps. Abraham sees Yahweh with two other beings standing together, and then he goes and he walks with him. Of course, Adam walking next to the Creator in the garden. Jacob stands next to him in the sacred place in Bethel. In fact, the whole story of Jacob is very, very interesting, and Bethel. We'll get to that in a second when we talk about standing stones. Moses, obviously, we have imagery with Moses having to take off his sandals because it's holy ground. What made the ground holy? The fact that God's feet were there. There's also verses where Moses and those gathered around him get a glimpse of the heavenly floor where Yahweh puts his feet and walks back and forth. Again, being able to grasp the idea that the God you worship is so real that he walks around, that there is a floor, albeit another heavenly realm of a floor, but that he has feet were made in his image. Granted, his feet are much larger than ours. The proportions of Yahweh are A, not consistent, but B, extremely big. And we'll point out examples of that as we go through this entire series. I think there's a quote here on page 32 that I wanted to read for you, just so you can better understand how significant this is. When the biblical story moves to Jerusalem, God's feet are there too. This time, they are surrounded by the fragrant trees of an Eden-like temple garden, which Yahweh says, "Glorify where my feet rest. This is the place for the soles of my feet, where I will reside among the people of Israel forever," he declares of his temple in the city. It is the place to which generations of his worshippers would flock to encounter the presence of the divine. In the Bible, God's feet are crucial to his social existence, fundamental to his very being, and so they are the bodily features by which he often renders himself evident in the world. The force of his feet splits mountains. They shake the earth as he strides out from the desert. They crush the bodies of his enemies. They transform dust and dirt into holy ground. His sure-footed presence in the earthly realm transforms a piece of ground into a place, and a place into a sacred place. Again, I hope that you can appreciate her writing. She is so good at conveying these ideas. It's almost poetic in how good her prose is, but it's all based and planted in, again, this very scholarly aspect of understanding the history of the Bible and of the people and places and times in which it was written and compiled. But do we see here just how much of an impact God's feet have? We're not done yet, though. Let's continue. What else does she cover in this chapter? Well, she gets into a bit of an evolutionary binge, which I love, where she talks about when we first came down from the trees, when we became bipedal, how important our feet were. We were not just motors. They were not just something to stand upon. It was so integral. And we lost some of that when we developed the leather boot. And she goes on to note that even as society has advanced, there's many markers of the society or the civilized, one being the boot. We lose that connection, that grounding that we might have had in more primitive states. We lost touch with our feet and the significance that they play. So she talks about that for a while, and it's very interesting and fascinating. And that's what I love, is she is just so accomplished and intelligent that we can learn so many things besides, well, what did God's feet in the Bible say about him, right? Like, that's the main part, but there are so many contributing building blocks that she plays with that, again, I just think she's so fascinating. Please come on the show, Francesca. And then we lead into the next section where, again, we get this wonderful history about the importance of standing stones, what they represented, what they might have meant, how they indicated holy places or places where people believed they could connect with a higher power or enter another realm, etc. And then she gives us the biblical version of that. And it's with Jacob and the story of Jacob's staircase, not ladder, in his dream, where he sees messengers going to and fro from the heavens. And that night he has slept with his head on a large stone, and he realizes he is in the place where God is. He calls it the standing place of God, Bethel. And again, if you watched episode 1, you'll understand the difference with El just being the supreme high God that Yahweh eventually usurps. So Bethel, the standing place of God, what Jacob does when he wakes from his dream is he lays that stone up to make it a standing stone, a place to recognize the importance of where God actually resides. Then what's interesting is we get this competition throughout other parts of the Bible with which parts are more holy or important. And so we have two competing claims. We have Jacob's claim with Bethel, the standing place of God, versus Jerusalem and the temple there, which is where God has said he will rest his feet. So both of these important claims that show both of these holy and sacred places are built off of the fact of it's where God's feet are. Again, I just cannot convey the importance to these ancient people of believing this is where God is, and the evidence for that is where his feet are. Because if his feet are there, of course he is there too. And from Yahweh's perspective, feet conveyed ownership. These are his people. This is where he dwells. This is his land, which leads us very well into the second part of this second chapter. So we've been talking about grounded, and now we're going to be talking about underfoot. And she starts this section off with a very sad but very interesting look at ancient practices of selling your children into some form of slavery because you were dying or starving or whatever the case might be, just the harsh realities of the ancient world. And they would use the child's footprint as a receipt, so to speak. Again, conveying ownership now. So she's just tying that in to talk about this ownership method, and then she's going to dive into her case here for the second part. She mentions all the rituals around sandals, all the different gods and the footwear they wore and why it was important instead of just being barefoot, that it literally prompted them up, it lifted them up to a higher status. And then she gives us some more biblical examples of feet showing ownership, like in the 5th book of the Bible where God tells them, wherever your feet tread, there you will own. This is talking about the conquest of the land of Canaan, that he is going to give this to them and they will take it by where they put their feet, which was also really common practice in buying property or taking property. The person who was losing the property would lift their foot from it, and the person who was taking it or claiming it would step upon it, right? These concepts are just so ingrained in our history. In Genesis, God has Abraham walk through the land of Canaan, showing the promise of what will eventually be theirs. In Job, we see that the Satan has some kind of domestic power here on earth as he gets to walk to and fro on the earth as he then reports up to the heavenly realm to dialogue with God. In Psalms, we hear God saying, on Edom I rest my foot, right? This territorial expansion, this ownership by way of taking, by planting. And there's just so many more biblical examples that she covers, and it's wonderful. We talk about some comparative gods and how they are doing the same thing. And then we move into this really interesting comparison. I'm so excited to share it with you. I'm actually going to read you some of the parts, so let me find that spot. So she starts off by referencing the Babylonian epic of Enuma Elish, which I know many of you might be familiar with. It predates anything we have in the Old Testament. And here we have the mighty god Marduk, who is mentioned in the Bible, defeats the fearsome Tiamat, the ancient mother of the gods and embodiment of the primeval sea. Its vivid celebration of Marduk's victory displays the cosmic power of the god's trampling feet. And then she quotes, he flung down her carcass, he took his stand upon it. The Lord trampled upon the frame of Tiamat, with which his merciless mace he crushed her skull. Just line after line after line referencing some domination via the feet. And again, this is a non-biblical source of a creation tale, that a god had to defeat chaos, which we see all over this area and time frame, and then out of chaos created the earth. It's actually a unique kind of creation story. But we don't just see it with Marduk in this particular story from the Babylonians. We have the same thing with Baal or Baal as he fights disorder, another name for chaos, to bring order, to bring creation. And Yahweh has his own version of this, and it's so often glazed over, but we see it in multiple parts of the Bible. So I'm going to read to you some of what she points out about the biblical version of this story. In the Bible, the battle is fought between Yahweh and the chaos monster, whose various names attest to its dangerously disordered, unbounded nature. We have Leviathan, which means the twisty one, Rahab, overflow, Yam, the sea, Nahar, the river flood, Tannin, the dragon or sea monster, and Tehom, the deep, many of which are the same names given to Baal's watery archenemy in the older Ugaritic myths of the battle with disorder. In several biblical texts, Yahweh is praised for driving back Yam, breaking the heads of the sea monsters, piercing Rahab, smashing the heads of Leviathan, dismembering and cutting openings in the corpse of chaos. It terrifies even the other deities in Yahweh's retinue. Quote, "Are not even the other gods overwhelmed at the sight of it?" Yahweh asks. "No one is so fierce as to dare stir it up. Who can stand before it? Who can confront it and be safe? Under this whole heaven, who?" This is when God is questioning Job. So not only do we have a reference to this very clear myth of the times that the gods have to battle chaos to bring order to the universe, but Yahweh is acknowledging the pantheon, which we know is accurate at this time, and saying it is me who stands above it. This is when Yahweh is making his case for being the greatest that eventually will move him into this kind of sole God other than the Trinity factor. It's all right here in the Hebrew Bible. It's absolutely fascinating. The answer to these questions is, of course, Yahweh, who subjugates the chaos monster by hooking it like a fish, filleting its body, and trampling it under his feet. Last thing I'll read to you really quick for today. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, God follows up his victory over the monster by pinning its watery body beneath his throne in his temple in Jerusalem. Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. Yahweh was explicitly cast as a divine king, seated in glory in a throne room in his temple. The fearsome chaos monster, now his subservient prisoner, its waters compelled to roar a hymn of praise to Yahweh's superior might. And she goes on to describe that praise that we have as listed in the Bible. And it's borrowed mythology or retellings or what people just came up with as they fought to understand their meaning and purpose here, right? These are deep, deep themes and archetypes that the human has created across many cultures and time. And I think that's what's so important to remember and what this book does such a good job of explaining. Yahweh's not special. The Bible's not special. We are just so historically, religiously, and mythologically ignorant that we think this is so unique and special in the world. It is not. There's two more big sections that I'm just going to encourage you to get the book and read. And by the way, I'll have the book listed in the description of every single episode with a link to Amazon. It's an affiliate link, so it'll help out the channel. But the last two things that she covers are the holy mountain or cosmic mountain aspect that we see in all religions and so many religions, and all the biblical verses that talk about all the times we find God residing or afoot in the high place on the mountain, atop the hill. There's a lot of significance there, a lot more religious comparison there. I think it's really, really fascinating. And then to end, we get this temple talk. We get back into the Jerusalem temple and its design and how big everything is and how it was actually meant for Yahweh to be there and reside because we had a God that was so powerful he could relax. He sits with his feet up, resting in this place. And what are his feet resting on? The Ark of the Covenant. Why he sits in a throne of terrifying cherubim. When God said that he was there, he meant it literally, and his people took it literally. What were people doing as they would come to the holies of holies to worship God? They were seated at his feet. This doesn't get any more ancient or traditional than to worship at the feet of something greater than yourself. They weren't holding his hand. They weren't looking at his face. They were always at his feet. And Yahweh is just reclined in his throne room, feet up, waiting for his worshipers to come and beg and grovel, to make sacrifices and do ornate rituals. God is like every other God at this time frame, power hungry, petty, surviving off of the gifts and worship of those who believe in him. And we'll get into all of that as we discuss other parts of God's body. So she does leave us with this little cliffhanger, and she's talking about, yep, God's up. He's being worshipped at his feet. He's conquered his enemies underfoot. He's dwelling now in the temple, but that won't always be the case. And if you've been following along in my secular Bible study series, you know that that time frame is coming to an end. So what happens next? And we'll pick up there when we get to chapter 3. So again, I don't have a structure set for when these episodes will come out. It's kind of as I can get to them, just putting them in randomly here during the week. So if you see them come up, please watch, click, subscribe, comment, do all the things. I'd love to help this series get big. I'd love to bring the attention of this book to so many people. I believe that this book has the power to do in just one book what I'm trying to do with this entire channel, which is just to show how man-made this God really is, how unoriginal and uninspired and ordinary this myth is, how ancient, that it's not something we should be utilizing in our current life in any capacity past, oh, there's a little bit of wisdom to be found here. We shouldn't be living and worshiping at the feet of this same ancient God. And so I hope that that is coming across very clear, and we're already seeing that here in chapter 2. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day, and until next time, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Oliver, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod and Kristi, and my Atheist advocates, Anne, Elijah, Rokkit, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in my mission, or you just enjoy watching the content, please consider joining these fine patrons. Thanks, and have a great day.